everybody, this is Jeremy Siskind. I'm the author of my new book, Solo Standards for Piano, as well as books you know and love, Playing Solo Jazz Piano, and the Jazz Piano Fundamentals series. And we're actually going to look at some pages from book 2 of the Jazz Piano Fundamentals series. So let's get right to work. What we're talking about today is separating out chord tones versus non-chord tones in jazz. And let's take just a pause to figure out the stakes. So first of all, why is it important to separate chord tones and non-chord tones? Well, on one hand, melodically, chord tones do not need to resolve, and non-chord tones do need to resolve. So if we're trying to analyze a solo, if we're trying to write a composition, we might keep in mind what's a chord tone, what's a non-chord tone. I feel like good improvisers and composers have a really strong sense of this. Now, the other half of the question is, why is it difficult to figure out what chord tones and non-chord tones are? I feel like in classical music, this really isn't difficult. It's very obvious what's part of a chord. Well, in jazz, we have all of these elements. We have upper extensions, we have alter tones, we have chord substitutions. And so it ends up being sometimes really difficult to ascertain what note should we count as part of the chord, and then what note should we not count as part of the chord, and what needs to resolve. So I have a thesis here. I'm coming in with a bias. You probably disagree with some part of it. That's okay. I'm sure, hopefully you'll learn something by considering it, and that's all that I ask. And my bias is this. In jazz, you don't need to know what the chord is to determine the chord tones and non-chord tones. And in fact, I think knowing what the chord is can be distracting. So let me show you, let's go on a little bit of a journey together. I haven't decided where I'm starting this video, but I think I've got a good idea now. So when I think about non-chord tones in a jazz context, I think about basically 3 categories. The first one is passing tones. Passing tones are going to connect by step, typically half step on either side. So assuming, if I see something like this, F, F sharp, G, that middle note could be considered a passing tone. And again, I'm not telling you what the chord is. Secondly, and I think this is the most important one, we have neighbor tones. Neighbor tones target a note from the chord and move into it by a half step. So here it would just be F sharp, G. And then lastly, we give this its own category, or I do at least in jazz, because they're so common, and that's enclosures. And enclosures can go above or below. They go above and then below a target chord note. So for instance, if G is the target note, A flat, a half step above, F sharp, a half step below, and then G. Now, in each of these cases, I've given you a chromatic example, because I think that's where this really becomes the most important in bebop styles. But we could imagine also having diatonic instances of each of these. So it could be E, F, G, and F is the passing tone. It could be F leading to G, and F is a neighbor tone. That's a little harder to buy, but depends on the context. And then an enclosure, it could be, for instance, diatonic above and chromatic below. So I think we're principally going to be talking about chromatic notes here, but not necessarily. So I want to go over to my book. This is from Jazz Piano Fundamentals, book 2. And this is in the section talking about closed position voicings or shearing voicings. And actually, I'm going to back up in this book, because this helps you hopefully understand the stakes of figuring out chord tones and non-chord tones. So I have this 3-step process of how a pianist creates closed position voicings. So the steps are listed here, really messily highlighting. So step 1 is that you're going to classify melody notes as either chord tones or non-chord tones. And then step 2 and 3, you're going to do something very different with the chord tones as with the non-chord tones. So in step 2, you're going to harmonize chord tones with other notes from the chord. So if it's a chord tone in C, you're going to harmonize it with notes from a C chord. Step 3 is you're going to harmonize non-chord tones, and then I give you 3 options with diminished seventh chords, side steps, or tonicizations. If you want to know what what these things all mean, there's a lot of information in the book. So I want to look through letter A and B here, and I've actually erased the chord symbols. There are chord symbols in the book, but I want to make my point to you. And actually, I'm going to erase these answers here so we can do this together without any bias. Cool. All right. So letter A. When I look here, I assume that the F has to be a chord tone. How do I know that without knowing what chord it is? Well, at least in this context, it doesn't resolve, and it's a really long note. So if it's not a chord tone, then it's going to be really dissonant for a really long time, and I would expect a resolution somehow. So this kind of has to be a chord tone. And then this E looks like a classic neighbor tone, right? It's leading in by step. In fact, it's leading in by half step. So I'm going to call it an NCT, a non-chord tone, and I would classify it as a neighbor tone. Now, you might say, how can you know that without knowing what chord it is? Well, let's try some different chords. So what if it's, well, actually, let's choose something where that E is really not going to be part of the chord. So what if it's E flat major 7? Okay, there's no question that E has to be a non-chord tone and the F has to be a chord tone. What if it's A flat major? Okay, if it's a regular old A flat major 7, we would call the F the 13th or the 6th, and the E would be a non-chord tone. Now, the next example we're going to look at is if it's D minor 7. Okay, and so this is more complicated because if you're thinking about the chord, you could say, well, the E is the 9th and the F is the 3rd, though they're both chord tones. And that's a possible analysis of this section, but as you're actually manipulating non-chord tones, for instance, in closed position voicings, you're going to find that the results are going to be much richer if you analyze that E as a non-chord tone. You're going to get some kind of a dissonance to consonance, really beautiful, colorful motion instead of just the 2 same chords twice. So even if we're imagining we're in a key like D minor, that in which we could consider both notes to be chord tones, I would still analyze it as non-chord tone to chord tone. I bet there's some real smart aleck who's like, well, what if it's in C major? Wouldn't it be a chord tone to a non-chord tone? Because E is the 3rd and F is the 4th. And I would just say, well, listen to this in C major. It doesn't work in C major unless you make the F resolve, in which case it's a non-chord tone. But like, there's not really a version of C major in which you just play this. So the question is like a little bit moot. Moot? Is that what you say? So in the book, I'll just reveal it. The chord that I gave was D minor 7. And I analyzed it like I suggested as a non-chord tone to a chord tone. All right. Now, on the other side of this double bar line, we have all skips, right? Skips, I mean, basically any interval other than a second. Here, it's all thirds. And when we have all thirds, each and every one of these has to be a chord tone. We do not skip. Almost always, I can think of exceptions, but we almost always don't skip into non-chord tones. So here, to me, the analysis is really easy. There's no question, whether I know the chord or I don't know the chord, that all these are chord tones. All these are CTs. And there's a pretty limited number of chords that could be. It could be D minor 7, which in fact in the book I'll reveal it is. It could be F major 7, it could be B flat major 7, sharp 11, it could be G sus, it could be E sus flat 9, something like that. But it really couldn't be, again, C major 7 because of that F natural, which needs to resolve. Okay, so there's not really a world in which all of these are not chord tones. It could not be A flat major 7. It's not generally accepted, those sounds, in our tonal jazz world. All right, so what about letter B? Let's take a look. So this is... So as we look, let's first identify that many of these are skips, right? So these are going to have to be chord tones. So then we have a step. And because of the rhythmic emphasis, I'm very much wanting to say that that one's going to be a non-chord tone, and this one's going to be a chord tone. Right? Doesn't it just feel like it's resolving? Okay. And then we have some more skips. So we know that these still have to be chord tones. And then we have what looks like a classic neighbor motion. So I'm going to analyze the one that looks like a neighbor that's moving between two more stable looking notes as the non-chord tone. And I'm going to finish up by calling this last one a chord tone. So the chord symbol that I gave here was C major 7. And so we could see, first of all, notice that this is all diatonic. We're not talking about chromatic notes outside of the key. We're talking about being in C major. And so our two non-chord tones are part of the C major scale. But here, again, their function is what's important. This is functioning as a neighbor. This is functioning as a neighbor as well. And so if I were going to be harmonizing this using closed position or drop 2 or even pentatonic voicings, I would want to harmonize all these chord tones. Harmonize all those chord tones with diminished chords, tonicization, side steps. I'd want to harmonize all the chord tones with notes from C major and all the non-chord tones with these colorful things, diminished seventh chords, tonicizations, and side steps. And let's just close, well, actually, a slightly more advanced way of looking at this is that we could also have compound melodies, right? In compound melodies, there's maybe a main melody and then other notes that are coming in above or below. So the example that I gave here is a pretty simple example. So there's this clear scale going down, right? A, G, F, E, D. And then there's this kind of pedal note below. You could consider these ghost notes, I think, if you want. And so what's interesting to me here is that we could analyze the top line as its own melody. So that even though we're skipping away from this G, we're actually hearing it as moving by step to the F. So I'm kind of playing, right? I'm playing that top line, and then adding in the bottom notes underneath. So that's a slightly more complex version of looking at chord tones versus non-chord tones. All right, well, let's close by looking at our famous Barry Harris scale. And, you know, people, I think, really think that they're going to learn closed position voicings from just playing this scale. And it's a really good place to start. This is all in my book, Jazz Piano Fundamentals, book 2, by the way. But the way that I see it is that this is a great alternation. It's a brilliant alternation between these chord tones and non-chord tones. And I try to see it in that context, that it's just alternating between a chord tone a passing tone, chord tone, passing tone, chord tone, passing tone, chord tone, passing tone, and then ending up on a chord tone. Okay, so what do I hope that you learned today? First of all, 3 types of non-chord tones. They all move by step into a chord tone, okay? So if it doesn't move by step, it's not a non-chord tone. Secondly, analysis of what chord tone, as in the 3rd, 5th, 7th, 9th, each note is only going to get you so far when you're trying to separate chord tones and non-chord tones. The dividing line is actually in how these things function rather than what numeral they are, what their relationship is to the score. Let me just go back and underline something that I blew past a little bit. So in this example A, I'm going out of the conclusion. It's too important, I'm sorry. We had 2 D minor 7s and we had 2 E's. In one case, same chord, same note, but because of the function, in one case, we analyze it as a non-chord tone. And the other case, because of the function, we analyze it as the chord tone. Here we would say it's the 9th. So it's not about the numeral, it's about the function. And you should more or less be able to figure out that function without even knowing what the chord symbol is. You should be looking at the shape of the melody, what is connecting by step, what is leaping, what's in a rhythmically strong position, which notes are longer. And that, more so than that analysis of numerals, is going to help you determine what's a chord tone, what's a non-chord tone. If you thought this was interesting or you want to learn more about this and closed position voicings, Jazz Piano Fundamentals Book 2 is your place to go. If you're looking for something new and exciting, Solo Standards for Piano is available now. Great, and let me give you a fun word to say in the comments if you've watched this far. I'm looking at palm trees at the window, so say something about a palm. All right, bye everybody.